Good morning, CHD viewers. We have a terrific show today that's going to feature John Leake and Dr. Peter McCullough talking about their incredible new book, Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality. So I'd like to start off with John and just ask you this. Why did you guys think that this was the great time, the best time to write this book? What inspired you to write it?
Well, Dr. McCullough and I have been talking since 2021 about the strange way in which the COVID-19 so-called vaccine, it's actually a genetic transfer product, a synthetic messenger RNA product, the sort of haste and also I would characterize it as chicanery, even outright fraud with which it was rolled out and imposed on all of mankind. And so over the last 4 years, we've just had conversations. If we were to go back in history and look at the entire vaccine enterprise from the beginning, is there a sort of red thread that goes from history all the way back to the early 18th century, all the way up to the present with our COVID-19 vaccine? And what we discovered is a remarkable uniformity of how mankind has conceived of vaccines from the beginning. And I think our primary surprising discovery is that it hasn't really been a strictly scientific enterprise. I would characterize vaccines and mankind's fascination and obsession with vaccines is more akin to a religion. And I studied philosophy, metaphysics, and religion. So it was something that I was fascinated by and found myself very drawn into the story, going back to where we start, the smallpox outbreak in Boston, Massachusetts in 1721. Dr. McCullough has all along the way brought to bear his medical scientific evaluation, and we've come to the same conclusion. I, as a historian, and Dr. McCullough, as a treating physician and medical scientist, we've kind of found out that we have the same view of the matter. So it was easy to write the book together.
So, Peter, let's switch to you here. My question is, you're using the words mythology and ideology. John kind of touched on that, but you've said before that skepticism is the bedrock of science. Why is it that we're not allowed to question vaccine science?
Unlike other areas of medicine, vaccinology, in a sense, is taken on a religious tone in medicine, and one can't challenge the religion of vaccinology. If we were to question cholesterol lowering medicine or blood pressure lowering, we could have a healthy debate. But as we research this, from the very beginning of medical history, there has not been a fair debate or discourse over vaccines, despite there being controversy from the very beginning. There was a very heavy hand, a theme of hubris, of arrogance, power, and money from the very beginning, Tony. And that's what we saw really come into full view in the COVID-19 pandemic.
So, John, here's a question for you. If vaccines are so safe and so effective, why do the manufacturers need a liability shield?
Well, as the manufacturers themselves plainly stated to Congress in 1986, well, I should say, we all know 1986 is a landmark moment with this legislation granting vaccine manufacturers blanket liability protection for all vaccines. But what I discovered in my research was the forbidden fruit of liability protection actually happened with the swine flu vaccine of 1976. which is an absolutely astonishing fiasco that, although 60 Minutes reported on it in a very critical way in a 1979 60 Minutes segment, we've forgotten that the 1976 swine flu was truly a fiasco. But as the vaccine manufacturers discovered, if you get liability protection, it doesn't really matter what the outcome of the mass vaccination program is. The United States government ends up footing the bill for, in the case of 76, it was about 500 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome and about 35 deaths before the program was halted. Well, as far as the vaccine manufacturers were concerned, that was the problem of the U.S. government. And in fact, it was. They had received liability protection. So they tasted the fruits of that in 76. And they again asked for that in 86 and were granted full liability protection. And, there was a famous Supreme Court, a landmark Supreme Court case, Brusewitz versus Wyeth. And Justice Sotomayor wrote the dissenting opinion in this landmark case. And she said, granting the vaccine manufacturers liability protection has, in effect, completely eliminated any incentive to improve them, to critically evaluate and improve the technology to make it safer. So that was a long way of answering your question. There is going to be a certain percentage of the population, and this is acknowledged by the manufacturers, that is injured or killed, but the intellectual approach to this is that number of children who are maimed or injured or killed, the proposition is that it will be that number will be grossly outnumbered by those who would otherwise suffer severe illness or death from the infectious disease. We have come to the conclusion that that's not exactly clear. That's one of the things that we discuss in the book. We have reason to doubt that proposition.
Yeah, it seems like it would be very hard to figure it out, given that in 1986, part of the proposition was that vaccines were so dangerous and they were going to lead to such great liability that then these companies needed full protection, or they were just going to either go out of business or stop creating these vaccines. So, that's a hard part of it to sort of get beyond, in that, what are they really trying to accomplish? In 1986, there were only 7 vaccines. Now we have, in some cases, people are getting 73, sometimes even more. So, Dr. McCullough, do you think that there was any real rationale or any logic to the idea that every future vaccine should get total liability protection, even though these are just products like any other product and they're all different?
There never was any rationale for it. And then we started to see practices change across the world. For example, in Sweden, when there was a safety problem with the cellular pertussis vaccine, for 17 years, Sweden had no pertussis vaccination whatsoever. And there wasn't a rebound of large numbers of cases of pertussis. The measles, mumps, rubella vaccine has been raised as a concern, that it's too much given all at once, and that triple combination causing side effects. And so Japan just doesn't allow it. They separate the vaccines. So you see this differential in worldwide vaccination practice. And then the other thing we point out is that infectious diseases and the fatalities from them have consistently come down over time with modern sanitation and food and air and water quality, with testing, antibiotics. And so the threat of measles mortality 100 years ago is not the same threat today, and neither is it for diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, or any of the infections. And in fact, in my clinical practice, I've never tested somebody for diphtheria or pertussis because we treat, a bronchitis with azithromycin. So what we've uncovered is that the vaccine religion or ideology says that vaccines are good. That means more is even better. And that there is a complete willful blindness to the safety of giving vaccines in combination. There's also a blindness to medical necessity or clinical indication. And I think where we're heading, Tony, is we're heading to a breaking point now. There is actually a burden of vaccination that children and the population face at hand. And people now across the entire world are starting to raise questions. So our book couldn't be better timed on how humanity got into this predicament.
I agree. I mean, I think that there really, hasn't ever been a time like this where people are starting to open up, people are willing to think about these things. And the idea that you can give liability protection against a product that hasn't been created yet. So you haven't looked at any studies, you don't know what's in it. It doesn't matter. Just the fact that you call it a vaccine means that it's safe and effective, even though the actual definition of a vaccine, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I believe that it's changed 5 times since 1986. So that we don't even really know what a vaccine is, but we do know that it's always safe and effective, regardless of what it is, regardless of what the studies show. And that seems to me to be potentially really just absurd, but there should be a question. So the question is, do you think that it's fair to say that vaccines work?
Doctor, would you like to take that, or shall I take?
We have in our title, we also have reality. And reality is, the observation, that we don't have large numbers of measles cases anymore. We simply don't. We don't have large numbers of chickenpox cases anymore. And, some of these illnesses we can remember as children. I got mumps as a child and chickenpox, and almost all the children my age got those illnesses. My parents got measles, and everyone in their age group got measles. So we have seen large-scale reductions in these illnesses, and I think vaccines have played a role in that. However, for every vaccine, there seems to be a price to pay, and that price to pay in many ways has been concealed from the public. It has not been acknowledged by the medical orthodoxy. It's almost as if this vaccine ideology wants to essentially say that it's the greater good of humanity that matters, and that if there are collateral damage, if there are casualties along the way, or even long-term side effects, that humanity just has to take it. So let me give you an example. Chickenpox has largely gone away. That's terrific. But now multiple studies show that those who've taken the chickenpox vaccine have a higher risk of shingles later on. So guess what? Now we have a shingles vaccine. Now we have a vaccine for a problem emerging, increased numbers from chickenpox vaccination. We no longer have large numbers of cases of measles, but and our book does spend a lot of time on this. We see a disturbing trend in increases in childhood neuropsychiatric diseases like autism spectrum disorder. And so there seems to be, and this has been my experience, Tony, in medicine as a doctor, there's no free lunch. For everything we do in medicine, there's always a counterbalancing force. There are risks and benefits, and what we make the case for is we need transparency. We need fair, balanced discussion. We can't have religious zealotry fuel this entire vaccine industry, at costs to the population.
Yeah, I would second that. I mean, the greatest irony is during the COVID-19 pandemic, we heard Anthony Fauci and others in our U.S. health agencies repeating the mantra, and it had a very mantra-like quality: we follow the science. But I think what's been remarkable to us as we've delved into this story is it hasn't really been a scientific enterprise. In fact, there's been a veil drawn over the enterprise where you can't subject the enterprise to scientific scrutiny. I mean, if you start the very act of raising questions, I mean, we saw this with the experience of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. going back to 2005. You can't even question this. And if you do, you're outcast and smeared and thrown out of polite society. If you're a medical professional, you're thrown out of the College of Physicians. Well, this is eerily similar to during the great religious wars of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries of being branded a heretic. You know, if you question religious orthodoxy like Martin Luther in Germany, well, you're excommunicated. And so we see this tendency to censure and excommunicate anybody who questions this. And we believe we're actually taking a scientific approach to this in our evaluation. The other thing I would like to note is that we're not anti-vaxxers. We see that there is utility in the concept. It's a very interesting concept. It just needs to be subjected to greater analysis and discussion.
That makes a lot of sense to me. So, Dr. McCullough, you had said that, due to better sanitation and those kinds of things, the dangers of viruses has gone down. But I think that you've also mentioned that viruses get weaker over time. That if you look at the measles outbreaks from 1910 and the number of people that the records show died, I mean, it's very hard to know what comorbidities they may have had. But 50 years later, by 1960, that number, the 2,000 who died in 2010, then goes down to 400 by 1960 to 62. So do you think that vaccines sometimes get credit for doing work that was just going to happen anyway, that the viruses were going to get weaker over time?
Well, the vaccines get credit for reducing mortality despite having valid large-scale randomized trials demonstrating mortality reduction, or even valid observational data. These are just time trend data. And don't forget, for measles, we've gone all the way from no hospital care to full ICU care, nebulization machines, nebulized steroids, bronchodilators, secondary antibiotics, vitamin A protocols. We even have measles immunoglobulin we can give. So we actually have a full suite of measles treatment. And I think the treatment for the severe cases has made a huge difference. And don't forget, Tony, we've had a reduction in diseases for which there's no vaccines. Erysipelas has gone away as a disease. Rheumatic fever is essentially gone. Tuberculosis, we used to have tuberculosis sanatoriums. Tuberculosis is very much under control with screening, detection, and treatment. No vaccines in those areas. So we shouldn't give credit to vaccines without having the scientific evidence. But, our reality assessment, and, John and I, we've taken vaccines. I have children, they've taken all the vaccines. We're not against vaccines as an intervention. I've never been harmed by a vaccine. My children have not been harmed. But what we've observed now is almost a form of mania that's come over the population. And this came into full view with the COVID-19 vaccines, where now we have a modified synthetic messenger RNA platform by and large being used. We're told that this vaccine needs to be given indefinitely every 6 to 12 months, irrespective of whether or not someone has had the infection. They can have the infection multiple times. They just keep taking the vaccine multiple times. It's a form of a mania. It's almost as if the vaccine represents a talisman or a good luck charm. I recently testified in the Senate, and there's now no more pushback about the dangers of the COVID vaccine or heart damage or blood clots. The final stand by the College of Cardinals of Vaccinology is that the COVID vaccines were worth it because they saved lives. And, I can tell you that assertion needs to be thoroughly challenged. In my view, it's not supported by the observations at hand. It's not supported by the data at hand. And it's my clinical interpretation that, sadly, the COVID-19 vaccines were an abject failure.
So you think that it's possible that we vaccinated billions of people, there were millions of injuries, but nobody really got a benefit?
I can't see that there was a benefit. Maybe early on, there could have been a reduction in the binary number of cases, but quickly after their approval, we were off to the Delta outbreak. And, vaccinated persons were coming down with COVID right and left. The CDC was overwhelmed with hospitalized and fatal cases of vaccinated persons. They just gave up keeping track. Our CDC director comes out in August of 2021 and says the vaccines don't stop transmission. I mean, we had a wholesale admission the vaccines weren't working. So now I think, 5 years into this failed vaccine campaign, the vaccinologists are trying to pick up the pieces. A lot of medical organizations are just on the sidelines now. They're I think, very shamefully silent on what's happened. And there is a growing call, a chorus of people who want this to be evaluated. They certainly want vaccine safety and vaccine injuries, disabilities, and deaths to be recognized. And they want an approach to help the United States and the world heal from the damage of the COVID-19 vaccine campaign.
John, what do you think the real justification is for vaccine mandates? I mean, my view is that if they work, then the people who want them get protection, and the people who don't want them take their own risk. Why is that a problem?
Well, the rationale for mandates is that no vaccine works perfectly. It's not a perfect immunization in terms of absolutely sterilizing and preventing, every single transmission. So the rationale that we're told is that vaccines can, and I think it's a theoretical proposition, but they can actually result in herd immunity, not only protection of the individual. So that's the rationale. But again, I mean, if you take the COVID-19 vaccine, what I think is fascinating is that Anthony Fauci and two of his colleagues at the NIH in 2022, so after the COVID vaccine had rolled out and after he'd relentlessly advocated it, he and his colleagues published a paper in which they acknowledged something that a famous Australian immunologist named Robert Clancy told me over dinner one night, namely, vaccines injected into the arm that induce blood antibodies are really totally ineffective against influenza and coronaviruses that rapidly replicate in the nasal passage. There's just not sufficient contact between the blood antibodies and the nasal cavity during this early period of rapid viral replication in the nose. So Dr. Clancy told me that over dinner. I thought that was rather interesting. And then about 2 months later, I read a paper by none other than Dr. Anthony Fauci and his colleagues saying the exact same thing, that blood antibody vaccines are not effective against corona, and influenza viruses. Now, the purpose of their paper was to advocate the creation of a whole new generation of products. But obviously implicit in it was his admission that the COVID-19 vaccine program that he'd so passionately and zealously advocated didn't work. I mean, we turn up many things that we present in our book. All of this is cited. The readers can look at all of the papers themselves. I think our readership is going to be astonished by a lot of what we present in our book that's out there. It's not that it's a secret. It's just that our public institutions and our mainstream media don't talk about it.
Yeah, well, anything that you're not allowed to talk about, ought to make you really question what's going on. But, there's so many fascinating things in this book. And I was thinking, John, maybe you can just tell us the story of Edward Jenner. Who was he? What did he invent? What's the controversy all around him? It'd be a nice story for viewers.
Well, I think Edward Jenner is a very charming character. He reminds me of somebody out of a Jane Austen novel. Jane Austen had cousins in Gloucestershire, in a Cotswold village in Gloucestershire, and she gently satirized English society of this late 18th, early 19th century period. And Jenner was an aspiring naturalist. He wrote a paper on the cuckoo, the bird, for the Royal Society. His paper on the cuckoo was published, which made him a fellow of the Royal Society. He had heard stories in Gloucestershire of dairymaids who, the story was, and it was something of a wives' tale, but it was a charming wives' tale, that dairymaids who had contracted this blister-like illness on their hands that seemed to be transferred from the udders of dairy cattle, they called it cowpox, that dairy maidens who'd had cowpox on their hands, these blisters on their hands, the perception was when smallpox came to town, as it did every now and then, the dairy maids didn't get it. So the thought was, could it be that this milder illness of cowpox rendered protection against the more virulent disease of smallpox? So what Jenner did, this idea had been going around Gloucestershire for decades. But what Jenner did was he invoked his authority as a fellow of the Royal Society, and he performed what he claimed in his paper was a challenge experiment on a little boy who was the son of his gardener, a little boy named Phipps. And he claimed that he first inoculated the Phipps boy with cowpox, with the matter that he took from cowpox ulcers. So he first inoculated the little boy with cowpox, and then he subsequently gave the boy a dose of virulent smallpox. He had obtained the matter from a smallpox patient, and he claimed in his paper that it worked, that the inoculation procedure with cowpox protected the Phipps boy from smallpox. So it's a charming idea. He presents it in a paper with a lot of Latin, and it kind of is dressed up in the language of science. And the Royal Society rejected the paper, so he published it himself in a pamphlet in London. It didn't catch on at first. There were a lot of flaws in the first edition. He made a number of revisions, which we talk about in the book, which are very interesting. But a long story made short for this interview is that Jenner's pamphlet really caught on. And I use the expression a charming idea because there is something charming about it. I mean, the idea that you can take disease-causing matter that only causes a mild illness that you easily get through, and that then will protect you against a severe illness which can cause death, disfigurement. It's a lovely idea. And it's understandable why mankind became so fascinated with this idea. Our argument in the book is, in this initial enthusiasm, it's almost like falling in love. You know, they say love is blind. There was mankind fell in love with this idea. and subsequently became blind to the innumerable signs that it was flawed. And so what we argue in our book is it goes back to Jenner. Mankind needs to start taking the blinders off and rationally evaluating this.
That makes a lot of sense to me. So let me ask Peter one more question, and that is, what do you think would happen if there were far fewer vaccines on the vaccine schedule now? Because, we've been told so many times on national television by, public policy people, by senior people in Washington that that vaccines save millions of lives. So what do you think would happen if we went back to the pre-1986 kind of levels where people got 5 or 7 or 9 vaccines?
The CDC published in 2024 a paper in MMWR claiming that routine childhood vaccination saved well more than 1 million lives. And if you go back and just count the number of deaths due to infectious diseases before a single vaccine was used, just with modern care, if you go back and count the number of polio deaths, for example, and do the math, it's mathematically impossible that vaccines save that many lives, even if they were perfect. So these are exaggerated claims based on data sometimes centuries ago, ignoring all the modern advancements in care. I can tell you in terms of safety, now safety always trumps efficacy. And at the FDA, we always present data in terms of safety before efficacy. In terms of safety, here's some general principles. Early vaccines, and we review this in our book, have had side effects and complications, for sure. Almost all of them did. And then over time, the vaccines have become safer, and we acknowledge that. I think the polio vaccine is a good example, the injectable IPV polio vaccine. The second principle is vaccines given separately appear to be much safer than giving them in bundled combinations. That's the reason why the Japanese don't allow, for instance, giving the measles, mumps, rubella shot together. The third principle is vaccines are much safer if they're given later in life beyond the window of immunologic and neurologic development. When the baby is small and the immune system is developing and the neurologic system, there's a real opportunity to have vaccinations cause side effects. And one of the most frightening side effects for parents is a febrile seizure. That is getting a big battery of vaccines all at once. In the United States, that could mean around the age 12 to 15 months, that could mean receiving 16 different vaccines all at once. A complication could be a febrile seizure, actually going home, high fever, and having a seizure. The CDC tells us about 3 to 4% of babies per year have a seizure. A leading cause of that is vaccination. And a critical paper by Nilsson and colleagues from Sweden, examine this. And if a child has a febrile seizure of any cause, the chances of developing a neuropsychiatric disorder, having brain damage from the seizure essentially, and that includes tics and epilepsy and attention deficit disorder and autism spectrum disorder, the chances of that composite occurring, Tony, is 40% if a febrile seizure occurs. We also know that febrile seizures in the hospital are related to apnea. That's been shown in a randomized trial recently. And if apnea occurs at home and the parents aren't there to witness it, it can result in sudden infant death syndrome. So all of these pieces are falling into place that we may have come to a breaking point on the total burden of vaccines that children are expected to endure, including ones started at the very beginning of life. So what may come from our work and the work of others, I anticipate, is a new normal where there's risk stratification, and when the risks clearly outweigh the benefits, that vaccines are given per individual for individual protection. And we give up this vaccine ideology, this aspiration of eliminating infectious diseases from the globe or protecting every single human. It is very unlikely in the future that we're going to have one size fits all, and that we'll have a much more rational approach. I mean, I'll give you an example. A child born with a respiratory condition like cystic fibrosis, they may need the full battery of respiratory vaccines to give them the type of protection that's warranted based on their risk. Whereas a child without a spleen, congenital asplenia, or if their spleen is removed due to treatment of a leukemia or lymphoma, they may require certain vaccines like meningococcal, Haemophilus, and pneumococcal vaccines. I mean, I strongly recommend those in my practice. But for a healthy child born today, and we spend time on this in our book, a healthy child born today, in today's modern era of medicine, multiple studies show that child is healthiest if they take no vaccines whatsoever.
Tony, if I could just add something that I would draw our audience their attention to this. It's something that we explicate very in great detail in our book. These extravagant claims that have been made for the last 30, 40 years about drastic reductions of mortality. So not morbidity. We're not talking about just the number of measles cases being reduced, but actual mortality from measles or mumps or rubella or diphtheria or whatever, any of the illnesses on the vaccine schedule. One of the things we do is we just go back and look at the U.S. vital statistics data that has been published every year for many, many decades, going all the way back to the 1930s. And you just add up the deaths that are attributed each year to these infectious diseases. And the result of this very simple data reference is that before the modern vaccine schedule was introduced, mortality from all of these diseases had reduced by way more than 90%. I mean, I'll just give you an example. This is from chapter 1 of the book. In the year 1946, 2 years before the era of mass vaccination began with the combined diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus vaccine, a total of 1,259 Americans died of diphtheria, 1,241 died of pertussis, and 585 died of tetanus, for a total of 3,085 deaths. Now, that's out of a nation in 1946, I think, of about 150 million people. The number of car accident fatalities that year in 1946, that data is published as well, was 10 times that number. So the other thing that we talk about is how the fear of infectious diseases is so amplified by our era of mass media, which is really introduced in the early 50s. By the time you get to the summer of 1952, which was the worst polio outbreak in recorded history, by then you have very uniform reporting of infectious diseases from all 50 states. That centralized reporting is combined with everybody having a radio and about 40% of the country already having a television. So this fear of infectious diseases is something that the attention of the entire country is relentlessly focused on. So that by the time you get to the year 1954 with Jonas Salk introducing the polio vaccine, most Americans were more afraid of atomic war than they were of polio. But in that worst year, the summer of 1952, there were 21,000 cases that were attributed to polio with some degree of paralysis. So 21,000 cases out of a population of 160 million people. Again, 10 times more people died in car accidents that year. But this relentless fear generation from mass media would have us believe that polio was this raging monster that was going to kill everybody. And so that putting this whole experience of infectious disease and immunization into perspective, I think our readers are going to be greatly surprised by a lot of the just published data.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important book for people to read. Clearly, blind faith in any kind of a medical intervention is just really dangerous. And this book is an incredible antidote to that, to blind faith. You know, that if you read this book, you're engaging in a discussion with Dr. McCullough and John Leake, who have really researched this well, who have thought about it well. And, you know, you should, even if you're sure that you know what you believe, you should read this book, understand the history, and really begin to think it through from the start. You know, that there's never a point in your thinking where you should just quit, where you should be willing to say, I know the truth, or, you know, this is just settled science. There is no settled science. And this book answers many of the questions you will have, but it also raises all kinds of new questions that you haven't thought of. Thanks so much, both of you, for coming on the show. And I hope that everybody watching this decides to go out and read the book. It's going to be well worth your time.
Thank you, Tony.